I want to begin by telling you about stone soup. When I moved back to Melbourne in late 2011 after 10 years overseas, I was delighted to be back with my family back home, but I didn't really have a community. Most of the people who I'd known before weren't there anymore. And so I wanted to try this thing that some friends of mine in San Francisco had done for many years. It was a curated monthly storytelling evening, which they put together for a public audience every month down at a gallery down the road. But the catch was that I had a full-time job. I didn't have a stable of expert storytellers waiting in the wings, and I didn't know of a suitable venue either. What I did have was a lounge room at my place, and a big wooden table, which is sort of another story, and a small circle of friends. And so I thought, well, let's start at my place and see how it goes and perhaps branch out from there. So on that first evening, around the big wooden table, I thought we'd roll a potluck dinner into it as well. And so we'd eaten, and I stood at the head of the table, and I welcomed people, and I shared a story from my travels. And at that point, we were completely out on a limb, because I didn't know what was going to happen next. But as the evening went on, we wove together a tapestry of stories from the contributions of everyone who was there. It was magical. And so the next month, instead of scouting for a professional venue and looking for expert storytellers, I just invited a larger group of friends over to my place. And month upon month, for a year and a half, what we did after that was get together for what we called Stone Soup, a community storytelling potluck evening that emerged from the contributions of everyone there. And we'd stumbled across this recipe that in some ways seemed, well, new to a lot of people, and yet at the same time ancient and sorely needed. And it came with two realizations that I thought were interesting. One was that, well, for one thing, the effort to result ratio in this whole process was a lot better than a lot of other things I've been involved with. You know, it wasn't an uphill battle. It was as if the zeitgeist was with us all the way along. And the second realization was that this appetite that I'd had for authentic storytelling was actually not a new thing for me. Strangely, it was something that had been with me for many years in the work I'd been doing already. I'm a professional futurist. What the hell does that mean? I hear you wondering. Well, I'll tell you what it isn't. It doesn't mean that I predict what the future's going to be. And I think that that constant expectation, the idea that looking at the future means trying to decide what exactly it is, shows what a grip linear thinking has on our imaginations. What my clients and students seem to find much more useful than that is this alternative point of departure, which is that because the future is unwritten, it is therefore plural. And the further out in time you try to look, the more obvious this actually becomes. This is why long-term predictions are almost always wrong, because mere extrapolation can't stand up to that kind of complexity. So my job is to help people map and understand and then navigate more wisely the alternatives that they have in front of them. And I've done this with all sorts of groups and all over the place. And I do it. Why do I do it? Well, I do it partly because it's really interesting. But I do it, I think, more deeply because it seems to me that the well-being of a great many people and a whole lot of other species actually, in some ways, depend on our being able to grapple with the future more effectively than we currently do. Now, there's a tradition here. I didn't make this up. In fact, one of the first scholarly futurists was a Dutch sociologist named Fred Polak. Now, Polak was Jewish, and he spent the Second World War hiding out in Nazi-occupied Netherlands. And he emerged from that harrowing experience, surprisingly, with this amazing sense that humanity was actually a future-creating species. And in the 1950s, he wrote this magnum opus, 2 volumes, called The Image of the Future, where he looked at the ways in which societies throughout time have thought about the future. And the pattern that he found was quite interesting. What he learned was that the rise and fall of images of the future precedes or accompanies the rise and fall of cultures. Once the image begins to decay and lose its vitality, the culture does not long survive. In other words, our collective ability to realize a positive future depends on our collective ability to imagine it. It's not that hard to believe, really, is it? I mean, when you look at this on smaller scales, you look at organizations, let's say, which begin to bleed staff and lose stock value when people lose faith in their future. Or think about even the level of interpersonal relationships. The writing is on the wall for a relationship when you can no longer imagine being happy with that person in the future. So I'm not suggesting that we accept Pollack's argument, hook, line, and sinker. I mean, for one thing, your idea of a positive future may be negative for me and vice versa. But I think we can use it as an invitation to think about which way the wind is blowing. And there are several places we can look at to think about that. One of them is the forecasts of scientific research. For instance, the International Panel on Climate Change report, which just came out. A second place to look is the storytelling, the speculative storytelling about the future, which in our culture usually is called science fiction. And a third place to look is in the political conversation, not just at election time, like you've just had, but day to day, because this, ostensibly is how we govern ourselves and decide where we want to go. But unless you're into rising sea level and zombies, there's not a lot of comfort to be found in any of those three areas. In fact, the issue essentially is that the science is grim, the sci-fi is overwhelmingly dystopian, and the political vision is absent more often than not. So I'm not saying that you won't find positive images of the future anywhere. That's not the argument. But the issue here is that this field, foresight or future studies, has existed for a couple of generations at least already. And the overall capacity that people have to imagine futures for themselves that they consider to be positive doesn't appear to be improving. I don't think that this is just a problem for futurists. This is not a professional cry for help. This is a crisis for humanity. Something isn't working about how we imagine the future collectively. And I think it's not that we've been getting everything wrong. We have a key part of it right. That key part is that it starts from that key insight that because the future is unwritten, it is plural. And this gets us out of the trap of constantly trying to predict and then constantly getting it wrong. But there's a missing piece. And the missing piece, I think, has to do with emotion. We'll come back to that in a second. The ways in which we use this idea of plurality are diverse, right? So, for instance, my mentor, Professor Jim Dater at the University of Hawaii, in the 1970s noticed that although there's any number of possible stories that you can tell about the future, there's only so many plot lines underpinning them. Growth, collapse, discipline, transformation. These he called the 4 generic images of the future, and that's an example of a way that you can create a set of scenarios to think about the future with and evaluate your plans. And scenarios generated this way or some other way are now considered as, essentially de rigueur when it comes to doing policy and strategy and planning process as well. And in a historical sense, I think all of this is significant because these are history-shaping tools that we didn't even have until a couple of decades ago. And all of this is a good start. But there's that missing piece. And in a nutshell, I think that missing piece is that we lack a culture of public imagination. I think the reason for this is not because foresight is irrelevant to people or that it's literally impossible for us. I just think that it's inherently abstract, isn't it? I mean, when you try to think about the long-term future, it's remote from our present experience, which makes it very hard for any considerations on that long-term time frame to compete with the urgent, material, present concerns that we have today. Now, this disconnects it from emotion and from our bodies, from basically everything below the neck is out of the picture. And if you think that humanity is just, about utility maximizing rationality, then perhaps you don't consider that to be a problem. But if you look at psychological research, people like Daniel Kahneman or Dan Gilbert, what they tell us is that humanity is ruled by its emotions, whether we like it or not, which really opens us onto a different way of approaching the whole space. And that's what me and my colleagues have been doing for the last several years, making this rigorous foresight work more immersive, participatory, tangible, and experiential. And for us, it began in about 2006, when the Hawaiian government wanted to engage the population in considering the futures for the islands out to the year 2050. We knew that we couldn't just walk into the room and give them bits of paper with generic images of the future written on them. What we did, me and my colleague Jake Dunnigan, and together with a battery of volunteers and 2 improv acting troupes, was to put 500 plus people into 4 different versions of the year 2050. So when they walked into the room, they were walking into a naturalization ceremony for post-climate change refugees. Or in a second room, they would get an orientation session for a compulsory community program, a crash course in sustainability skills. In the third room, they were watching live on stage a debate between candidates for governor in the year 2050. And in the last room, they got a guided tour of the menu of bodily and mental enhancements in a post-human enhancement depot, which is sort of a cross between a mechanic's workshop and a hospital surgery. Attendees were able to use these experiential scenarios as a basis for deep discussions about what they did and did not want, and did not expect in their futures. And we've done these things in all sorts of circumstances, and concomitant with that, at the same time, there's been an emerging practice in design called design fiction, which focuses more on objects than on live experiences. But you might ask, how is all this different from previous attempts to immerse people in the future, like Disney's Tomorrowland, or the 1939 Futurama exhibit at the World's Fair in New York? The key difference, I think, lies in the answer to the question, whose future is this? Because futures studies, foresight, done properly, is not about selling you a future, it is about enabling you to create one for yourself. I want to share with you 5 things that I've learned about doing foresight with groups, not just the experiential stuff, but participatory processes of all sorts over the last 10 years. The first thing is, dig where you stand. There's nothing sadder than what our colleague Sohail Inayatullah calls used futures, aspirations that are copy-pasted from one context into another. The whole discourse of development is based on this, that the future of this place is actually the present of that presumably better place. It's nonsense. And one thing that needs to be realized about this is that these processes depend on us engaging with the place as we find it. So for instance, I've already mentioned the Hawaii 2050 scenarios. Another example is in Phoenix, Arizona last year, we staged an experiential scenario about sustainability, which reached back all the way back to the prehistory of the city. The reason why Phoenix is called that, by the way, is because it is built on top of the ruins of an earlier civilization. Do not accept the future that has been imagined for you and imposed upon you. The second point, make safe space for dangerous conversations. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead said that it is the duty of the future to be dangerous. And I agree. There is no point at looking at the future unless you are prepared to find something that might unsettle you there. Because even the most hopeful possibilities would mean scary change for somebody. As Jake and I often say, it's better to be surprised by a simulation than blindsided by reality. So whatever the plan is for, continue to pluralize the futures against which it could play out and be open to the possibility that that plan might need to change. The third point is think bazaars, not just cathedrals. Open source software advocate Eric Raymond talks about 2 ways of making software, evoking the difference between a top-down traditional way of making software, cathedrals, and the bottom-up chaotic way of open source, bazaars. Being far-sighted doesn't mean building everything for permanence, to last forever, once and for all. Temporariness and transitionality are part of life, and the best seeds for the future are often planted not by visionary plans, but by experiment, improvisation, and accident. In this city, Gap Filler and Festa are excellent examples of bazaars, as is the meeting process called open space technology, which has been used in all sorts of contexts over the last 30 years. And the reason it works, there's no pre-planned agenda. It's created by the participants. And the reason it works is not because of magic, it's because of self-organization. The outcomes are genuinely co-created rather than being pre-digested. The fourth point is own your own part. The more capacity you have to contribute to shaping the future, the more responsibility you bear, whatever position you have in society. So instead of asking, why aren't they doing X? Perhaps try asking the question instead, what could I do to make X possible? My collaborators and I have found that guerrilla projects, guerrilla futures, that is, unsolicited projects, are often useful when the official planning processes fall short, as in Found Futures, Chinatown, where we imagined a series of scenarios for the neighborhood in Honolulu in 2007, brought forth the near-future prospect of gentrification, and it ended up on the front page of the newspaper because it sparked a debate that we felt was vital in order for these decisions to be made by the community rather than for it. And the fifth point, keep doing it. Plans are brittle without a layer of living foresight to inform them. And however foolish, it's surprisingly common to look at 2030 or 2050 just once and then to sit back and wait for some surprise to blow those best-laid plans out of the water. A built-in cultural capacity, what futurist Richard Slaughter calls social foresight, is what we're driving at here and where I believe we need to go. What all this boils down to is a practice for overlaying possible futures on the present on an ongoing basis, a platform for public imagination. And we're not there yet, but I want to tell you about the most hopeful sign that this is on its way. So in January 2011, in Tunisia, after a month of mass protests, the Prime Minister resigned his post and fled the country. This was the opening salvo in what became known to the world as the Arab Spring. And in the weeks following that, people, the revolutionaries who hadn't expected to succeed necessarily, were not getting back to work and taking the steps to move the country forward. A half-revolution had occurred, and the future of the country was deeply uncertain. Against that backdrop, a Tunis-based creative agency staged a transmedia experiential scenario where they brought a positive vision for the future of Tunisia into people's lives in an immediate way. That is to say, for one day, across television, radio, press, and social media, they all reported from 3 years and 3 months into the future, the 16th of June 2016. And by the end of that day, they had garnered national as well as international attention and begun to change the conversation in Tunisia. Now, that was in February 2011. Just at the time that Tunisia was beginning to imagine its next chapter, this city, Christchurch, was facing a different kind of upheaval. And the gaps that an earthquake leaves are different from the gaps left by a revolution, but I think the challenge and the opportunity for public imagination are not so different. So on the 16th of June 2014, next year, we are going to be inviting people around the world to take part in an experiential futures festival of sorts, inviting people to imagine the futures of the places where they are and perform them in the present, bring them into tangible form, and share them with each other. Christchurch belongs in that conversation, and I certainly hope it will be. I see a clear need and opportunity for an ongoing platform of public imagination. And at an individual level today, we can begin to do this by cultivating, at the very manageable scale of our lounge rooms, our own capacity for telling our own stories. The reason why Stone Soup storytelling potlucks, I think, have worked so well is because they give people an immediate and tangible experience of the powerful sense of what it is to forge community and a story for themselves. If co-authoring our collective destiny is the great challenge of our time, then the future that we get from among the multitudes possible is the one that we author together. And as we carry on in that journey, we must continue to ask the question, whose future is this? Whose future is this? And the answer that I wish for you, for all of us, is simple. It is ours.